Right, how do I put that onto? Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining Childhood and Society SIG Seminar Series 2025 with an early start, just in 24 with Professor Jayne Osgood. We're really welcoming all people that have joined us before and new people who are just joining our series now. I will put a link onto the chat so you can see all the other exciting presentations we've got lined up for the year. And please do disseminate if you feel anybody would be interested in particular subjects or topics of their expertise. So this is a safe space. We're going to open it up for a seminar with Jayne and then have some time at the end for some dialogue, questions, networking, anything at all. And please do pop your reflections into the chat so we can engage with them afterwards. So I'd like to welcome everybody to Jayne's session today, How Gender Comes to Matter, Tracing Matter, Space, Place, Time and Effect in Early Childhood Research. So Jayne, you're very welcome, and thank you so much for kicking off our series this year.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the introduction. And yeah, so today the seminar falls under the rubric of difficult dialogues. And you might well wonder, well, what is especially difficult about children and gender? Well, as a childhood scholar working with gender and sexualities in early childhood, it is contentious terrain. And I'm quite excited by this kind of new materialist, feminist, post-humanist turn in childhood studies, which approaches the study of gender in a slightly different way by foregrounding, as Angela says, matter, space, place, time, and affect, as well as the human subject. So what I want to do is to map out how this turn, this post-humanist turn in childhood studies has come about, what it makes possible, and what it entails. And I do that by providing a few examples from my own research in this space, but also from others who are working with post-humanist theories to expand and deepen and complexify how we think about gender in early childhood and how we go about researching it. So I want to just say, first of all, that this presentation is based upon a chapter that I co-authored with a former PhD student of mine, Sid Mohandas, and the title is How Gender Comes to Matter, Tracing Matter, Place, Time and Affect in Early Childhood Research. And it's in a handbook of gender and sexuality in childhood. So there's a vast number of chapters in that book. It's not yet out in the world, but it's due any day. And really it is a collection, a rich collection of feminist scholars, gender scholars coming together to consider the various ways in which it's possible to research gender and sexuality in childhood. And so Sid and I were invited to author the chapter that engaged with post-humanist theory and post-humanist research practice and what that looks like, what it entails and what it makes possible. So just to say that, yeah, let's just get cracking, actually. Okay, so many people sort of balk when they hear feminist new materialism or post-humanism, like what on earth is that? And why might we even engage with that when the approaches we've always used to researching with children and issues of gender have served us very well? Well, what some of the kind of rationale for the shift, if you like, is because it's born of a recognition that as researchers, we're never separate from that which we research. And it's not only about human to human interactions or human subjective experiences of the world. There's so much else going on that frames who we are, how we perform our gender, how we negotiate it, and what's possible in different spaces and places and times at different moments. So feminist new materialism or critical post-humanism, feminist post-humanism, broadly, how that differs is that it builds upon a very long tradition of feminist post-structuralism. And feminist post-structuralism urged us to think about not just the human subject, but language, the significance of language, and the significance of how gendered identities are constructed through discourse. And discourses are everywhere. And so we have discourses of heteronormativity, discourses of femininity, masculinity, discourses of schooling, and all of those things coalesce to kind of position us as particular sorts of gendered subjects. And that was really useful, a really useful framework. And I think it's really important to remember that feminist new materialism is not a break from feminist post-structuralism, but rather a continuation and a complexification
I got you.
of of that work that's really important. And feminist research has long argued that the personal is political, that our embodied experiences of things shape our understandings. So again, not a radical departure, but building upon that which was already fairly well established. So the key things really to think with or think about when approaching post-humanist is that it does not erase the
Got
human.
it.
Somebody's got their microphone on. If you could just put yourself on silent, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so the kind of core tenets to feminist new materialism is that research is always entangled and immersed. It's never a neat thing that you do that's separate out there, that you go and objectively observe and gather data as if it doesn't affect you and you don't affect it. So that's one premise of feminist research generally, but specifically it's foregrounded in feminist new materialist approaches. And also it's about rather than trying to control the uncertainty or the speculative not knowing that you often encounter when you undertake research, particularly with very young children who can be very squiggly and unpredictable, is to actually embrace that you don't know everything, embrace that you don't know what's going to happen, and embrace that that can will present you with some surprises that you can learn with and from. And it also connects to this idea of knowledge being constantly in the process. So it's a process ontology. Nothing stands still. We're always in the middle of things, and knowledge is being constantly generated. And it also responds to an urgent need to tell other stories. Quite often, gender research, gender and sexuality research can, not intentionally necessarily, but gendered subjects can be positioned in victim narratives or as somehow othered or marginalized. When we take this approach, we can start to think about how gender is lively and more than human and being ultimately produced in every moment of every day in ways that we can't necessarily predict. What I'll do is I'll go on to provide some examples of how this takes shape in research, but these are just some fundamental tenets of the philosophical, epistemological, onto-epistemological approach that's taken in this sort of research. Okay, so I think I've skipped, but that's fine. That just leaves us with more time to chat at the end. So as I've said, post-humanist theory is very much research in this key is very much philosophically informed. So it's really thinking about the significance of theory and philosophy and how that has implications for the shape that research takes, particularly when researching gendered childhoods. So the concern becomes with what concepts have the potential to do, what they agitate, and how they can be productively put to work to make a difference in how we understand gender, and in turn, how that shapes research and practice with young children. So the philosophy is absolutely central to what we're doing in this approach. And what it does is it displaces the childhood researcher as the all-knowing, the expert, the dispassionate, objective observer viewing that which is out there somehow. And instead, it foregrounds entangled authorship, where knowledges and worlds are produced together with non-humans, other than humans, and more than humans. And that means moving away from binaries of objectivity and subjectivity, and instead viewing the childhood researcher as in the world, so entangled and immersed. You're not in the business of extracting data from a given scenario. You're in the thick of it, and you have no choice in that matter. Furthermore, feminist post-humanist approach creates possibilities for experimentation, so they're not knowing, and often is characterized by creative, artistic, embodied, and transformative practices and methods. So as I've said, the humanist child is decentered in such approaches, but the children are never erased from the research process. They are still there, they are still very present, but they are entangled and immersed as well. So rather than child and child agency, rather child and child agency become expanded in ways that upend divisive distinctions between human societies and natural environments. So as I mentioned, there's decades of research by feminist post-structuralists, postmodernists, and queer theorists that have shifted debates, policies, and practice concerning gender and childhood. But feminist new materialisms are, as I've said, not a radical break from past feminist approaches, but they expand beyond the discursive to include material agencies in conceptualizations of gendered childhoods. So how gender is constantly becoming and produced through micro moments. So this involves attention to material agency, and problematizes the idea that matter, material, spaces, places, atmospheres, somehow provide a gender neutral backdrop. So you can't then you can't think about gender without taking into account space, affect, time, matter, and how they all work together to reproduce gender through children's play or everyday activities in early childhood contexts. So there then becomes an acute kind of focus on everyday objects, and at first sight it can seem to be a little bit frivolous. Why would we be worrying about glitter and cow figurines and snot and Lego and tea and tutus and dress up? Well, actually, if you make matter your starting place and children's entanglement with that, you arrive at a different place and you explore through a different lens. As I say, it's through creative and generative experimentation rather than a very clear idea that you know what you're going in search of and you will gather the data to prove it. So in this chapter that Sid and I wrote, we write about studies that chose us. Of course, we exercise some human agency around which which studies got included in our chapter. But nevertheless, we had some kind of deep connection with each of these authors and each of these studies. And as you can see, we didn't offer a linear account starting from the oldest to the newest, but we traced how this methodology and way of researching actually threads through this corpus of post-humanist feminist studies in childhood around gender. So as you can see, it includes some of our own publications and that of others working in a range of geopolitical contexts. But what unites all of these studies is a concern to explore how gender is produced temporally, bodily, and materially, and how it's situated in uncertain ways. So this collection is approached diffractively in the chapter. We don't offer a chronological account of how post-humanist studies have evolved, because they haven't. They're read through each other, and they move back and forth through history and time and space. But what we were really struck by this small selection of studies is that they offer really lively moments, so very vivid accounts of research with young children in early childhood contexts, which have capacities to transport the reader to the messy complexity of specific encounters. and to contemplate what that might potentiate for gender to be reconceptualized in more hopeful ways and potentially more activist ways. So through this lens, gender is understood to hold the potential to become anew in each micro encounter. And different becomings are made visible and possible so that young children are enabled to experience gender outside of regulatory heteronormative frameworks, leading us to claim that feminist post-humanist studies is a hopeful science. So just working our way through these, Jen Littleton-Smith draws from Karen Barrad's agential realism, and she considers how space and matter work together, how they interactively participate to produce gender. And she explores how the material environment of preschool classrooms contributes to early childhood experiences of gender. So it's not only the human subject exercising agency to perform a certain form of gender in preschool context. Her argument is that it's so much more. It's the space, it's the place. And she focused specifically on two areas of the classroom: home corner, which has long been the subject of early childhood research, and particularly gender, for how it reinforces heteronormative ideas about women's work and the kitchen. And also another area that she focuses on is small world. And these spaces highlighted the significance of zones and objects within them. So she focuses on dolls, block towers, plastic teapots, and dress-up costumes. And she argues that this supports the kind of direct challenge to gender roles, because something else happens. If you don't go there looking for home corner is about reinforcing stereotypical ideas about women's work, something else emerges. And so she's open to the surprises, she's open to kind of sitting with the trouble as it emerges. And as a consequence, she's offered these moments where binary gender roles are disrupted through the interaction of matter, bodies, places, spaces, times, atmospheres. Next, E.J. Reynolds and David Miller, back in 2013, were attuning to the ordinary everyday affects, the atmospheres, what they sense, and how that circulates across and through bodies. And they argue that the subject is always produced in relation to other bodies and other things. So their theorists that they put to work are Deleuze and Guattari, and their process philosophy. And what they do is they pay very close attention to and undertake multisensory mapping of objects, sounds, and bodies within the preschool environment. And that enables them to map out the complex gendered relationalities that are textured through the life of everyday nursery existence. So they do something to ordinary ethnography. It's not simply a case of observing, but something else happens when you put post-humanist concepts to work. They describe this as multisensory microethnography. So they're zoning in, honing in on the really tiny stuff that you probably wouldn't notice if you weren't working with these process ontologies, process philosophies. So they argue that taking this approach allows them to tune into that which would conventionally be overlooked or regarded as little more than an environmental context. So it becomes possible to attune to the ways that gender works on, in, and across bodies, and so facilitates seeing beyond only linguistic and textual boundaries. So their post-humanist approach foregrounds being there through deep attunement and sensing the middles of becomings. And they argue it's by noticing and paying attention to the what else that other conceptualizations of how gender comes to matter in young children's lives are arrived at. And then next, sort of going back nearly a decade now, in 2015, I undertook some research in my own home, and this is not uncommon for posthumanist researchers because research is everywhere and the everyday is intriguing and sparks your curiosity. And I was really interested in everyday observations of gendered becomings through children's play that unfolds within assemblages of things, affective forces, sensory incidents, and human, non-human relationalities. So I was focusing on the play encounters of a 3-year-old girl. And what I noticed through this close attunement, not hugely dissimilar to Mellor and Reynolds' work, was that gendered becomings in early childhood are constantly negotiated and resisted, celebrated and transgressed. So this is ongoing dance. It's not as predictable or inevitable as we might think. And I was really drawn to entanglements of this 3-year-old girl with a ballet tutu, a birthday party, plastic dolls, flamenco dresses, muddy feet, and a bubblegum pink doll's house. And so it was this heightened attention to materials and effective forces that work with and through children that ideas about gendering processes in everyday encounters could be unsettled. So I was working particularly with Rosie Braidotti's work, and thinking about child and gender as a series of multiple becomings set within relational assemblages, which create novel ways to observe, sense, and register the everydayness of young gendered childhoods, and to dwell upon the tiny ruptures that emerge and can cause a stutter in our thinking. And then next, Tuya Hookie and E.J. Reynolds in this project entitled Crush, which was based in Finland, northern Finland, draw upon ethnographic multimodal data of gendered and sexual dynamics in preschool play in a rapidly declining fishing and farming community in North Finland. So the context is very, very relevant, and the specificity of it then bubbles up through their observations and the sense that they make of gender. So they're working with Deleuze and Guattari as well, and they give a glimpse into sense making of these very short video clips that they have of an episode where 3 boys repeatedly pile up on this one girl and demand a kiss from her. And whilst they're troubled by what's unfolding in front of them, they, working with these philosophies and concepts, enables them to tap into what else was unfolding in the event, in the moment. And it enables them to move away from immediate readings of victim, consent, and power, and rather they map these crush assemblages through the more than human force relations at play to allow thinking otherwise about gender. So that immediate, this is what we're seeing, and this is the sense we can make of it, actually is disrupted. And then a more recent piece by Sid Mahandis and myself is where we are with the situation is a Montessori classroom, and particularly the discourses surrounding Montessori as a middle-class phenomenon. We start to think about Montessori's approach to childhood observation as a civilizing project. And so we work with 3 specific encounters within a Montessori early childhood setting that concern an iPad, a mini Bowden pinafore dress, and snot. And when we sit with these and what the encounters generate, we start to see the material, discursive, affective manifestation of gender, social class, age, sexuality, and race, and what that means within a Montessori context where gender is not seen as an issue. So we start to engage with different imaginaries of child that refuse to erase fleshy, leaky, porous, and codified child bodies in early years context. And it also, the space-time mattering means that we're shuttling back and forth. So Montessori's readings and writings from over a century ago, and then how that manifests and bubbles up and surfaces within an early childhood setting in 2025. But it's really being affected, allowing the atmospheric forces in the space to work on us, that we're able to sit with the discomfort and wonder where that might take us. So Jessica Prioletta actually draws upon Jen Littleton-Smith's research, and she again focuses on spaces and objects of play and how they're active in the enactment and normalization of gender violence in kindergarten. So she's located in Canada, and she, like Littleton Smith, focuses on specific areas in the preschool classroom and specific objects, and she attunes to the capacities of what she terms sprawling matter to destabilize gendered block encounters, and sees these as presenting hopeful ruptures. So I hope you're kind of getting the sense that by attuning to the very small stuff, the seemingly insignificant, and how matter and atmospheres and spaces and places and histories kind of come together to force us to think about gender in other ways, in more confederate and kind of experimental ways. And then finally, but in fact, it was one of the earlier pieces of post-humanist research in gender, was a piece I wrote with Miriam Jrini around putting post-humanist theory to work to reconfigure gender in early childhood art, in early childhood. I think some of the titles dropped off there, but it's in Global Studies of Childhood. And in that paper, we work with Donna Haraway, and we offer multiple provocations to think differently about the regulation and governance of gender. And we do this by taking a step back to consider gender more expansively and generatively as ongoing becomings. And so we're thinking about how theory becomes method through arts-based practice. And the fundamental questions we ask ourselves, because this at the time and still now is seen as quite a sort of risky, novel way to undertake research, is what counts as valid knowledge? So this comes from Patty Lather. What counts as data? What does data do? And what do we do with what data does? So it's about the liveliness of research. Okay, so we've got these selection of studies that interweave and in some ways represent a sort of corpus or a body of post-humanist feminist approaches to studying gender in early childhood. And so what matters in post-humanist studies of gender in early childhood? And I think as I'm trying to kind of convey to you, what matters in post-humanist studies of gender in early childhood is shifting the focal point away from the human subject. And we do that because it allows other matters of concern to enter into the frame of investigation. So it's working with process ontologies, the becomings, the ongoingness, the never-endingness, the flattened hierarchies that displace human from the top of these hierarchies. And it also insists upon heightened ethical responsibilities, and it fundamentally alters what research is, and how we understand research, and what counts as valid in that space. So thinking again with those questions posed by Patty Lather. So what we argue in this chapter, drawing from this range of studies, is that matter matters. So the studies in various ways take up the invitation to make matter matter, to start with materiality, and to take seriously the force relations and the vitality of matter. And here we're kind of working with the ideas of Jane Bennett. So the role that matter plays in gendering processes in early childhood demands that researchers attend to how objects pulse and vibrate. Nothing is inert. And to recognize matter's capacities to deepen our sense making. And it's through multisensory mapping that close attention to noise events. So this is Meller and Reynolds. And the Barbie doll appeared as a vital agent in their research. Over several months, they tuned into the ebb and flow of life in the nursery and felt discomfort at the relationship between a boy and a girl child, which on the surface appears shaped by hegemonic masculinity and subservient femininity. But through this multisensory mapping and a close attunement to emergent social worlds within the nursery that are made up of events, actions, relations that are experienced orally and aurally through sight, touch, and taste and emotions, then gender can be understood in other ways. An analysis of the power of things is offered by the authors when Barbie Sophie meets Action Man Tyler. A 4-minute observation of these two preschool children playing with the Barbie doll, which might have led to heteronormative explanations of what was going on. However, their analysis makes felt the doingness of gender as a complex, affective assemblage of other bodies and things. And in a similar way, Littleton Smith pays attention, multisensory attention to gender as iterative, as being produced, as fluid and multiply becoming, as it's bound up with material discursive configurations in its emergence. So she has this beautiful section where she dwells upon the Teapot Rebellion, which takes place amongst a huge group of 3 and 4-year-olds. And she draws attention to objects of conflict as everyday matter is configured to enable gender to be enacted in surprising ways as it morphs through the chaotic and serendipitous ebb and flow of children's play. So these research observations and the subsequent feminist posthumanist analysis stress that materialities are imbued with gendering relations of power that provide conditions of possibility for gender otherwise to surface, to materialize. And this is also explored in my research from 2014 and that which I undertook with Miriam Srini in 2015, where we pay close attention to what else a ballet tutu can make possible in the life of a 3-year-old girl, a hyper-feminized, pink, girly accessory becomes something else when taken seriously and focused upon intently. So taking matter seriously offers nuanced and complex ways in which to reappraise how gender and sexual power relations come about in early childhood. And it's from witnessing the complexity of emergent material discursive temporal gendered becomings of young children that we can be broken free from the limiting regulatory containment of heteronormativity that works to fix children in narrow gender binaries. So moving on, what else matters? As I've mentioned, place is significant. Location and place-based politics have long been core features of feminist and decolonial scholarship and practice, and they are taken to the heart of feminist new materialist approaches. And this has a debt of gratitude to Indigenous feminisms by revitalising place-based inquiry and its potential to unsettle anthropocentric, human-centric, colonial and extractivist relations to land. Place is therefore understood as an agentic participant. It's not a backdrop, it's not a context, it's an actor, it's an agent, and it constitutes childhood encounters. It contributes in significant ways. So one example of this is through Tuya Hookie and Reynolds research in 2016 that, as I said, was in a coastal town in northern Finland where the fishing industry was in decline. And it was the historical transformations to place and landscape in that context where the dynamic way that land relations imbue everyday play encounters surfaced. So it was not apolitical, it was significant in the way that it bubbled up and the way in which it generated particular atmospheric forces within contemporary children's play. So there was within their research observations, there was a local restaurant that emerged as a key player in the crush encounters that they recount. And the village centre was where the local restaurant is located. And to quote them, it's a notorious haunt for many of the local residents who eat, drink, and trade illegal drugs. And it seems to operate as a physical and effective container for the intergenerational collective trauma of the neglected ancient local community body, and an increasing first generation of unemployed children and the professional classes. So we start to, and this also bubbles up in E.J. Reynolds' work in mining towns in Wales, where coal and mining and working class inheritances bubble up in contemporary childhood play and gendered becomings. So these place-based hierarchies leak into children's play and further complicate how gender and sexual power relations are understood in the early years. So what else matters in childhood research about gender from this orientation? Well, space-time matters. So space and time matter differently in the ways that gender and sexuality in early childhood are conceptualized and researched. Space and time, are like place, are no longer viewed as backdrops, moving relentlessly in a predictable, measurable, and linear manner. Instead, borrowing from Karen Barad, space-time matter in one word, are iteratively reconfigured and enfolded through the world's ongoing interactivity. So space-time comes into being through each interaction, each micro moment, each encounter, and materialize what Haraway refers to as thick presence. Produced through the interweaving of different temporalities and spatialities. So the temporal thickness and elasticity of space-time can be seen in the unfolding of micro moments, such as a split-second encounter involving an iPad, which is myself and Sid, or a video recording that lasts just 4 minutes and 14 seconds, which is Reynolds and Mellor. So each of these micro moments are richly constituted multiple and emergent reconfigurings of space-time mattering. So it's really exciting, actually, when you start to think about space-time matter as completely interwoven, and how focusing on these micro moments and interaction can actually take your investigations and analysis in all sorts of unanticipated directions. And what the authors argue is that some objects become stickier than others in the encounter, in the interaction of bodies, discourses, and nursery space-time. So that you start to identify civilizing forces or heteronormative forces in which past and present interact and coalesce with space to materialize gender in some ways and not others. So finally, affect matters. So affect in the post-humanist sense, not in the psychological sense. So embedded within each of the studies that I've mentioned and that feature in the chapter is a concern with affect. And by affect, we mean atmospheric forces, the feltness of gendering processes in childhood research. And affect is never separate from matter, time, space, or place. Rather, affective forces are generated from the material discursive assemblages, where all such matterings come to matter. So this is where feminist post-humanist childhood research takes on a specific tone and pace that involves a deep affective attunement to the ordinary and everyday by exercising what Anna Zing terms the arts of noticing, and insisting that close attention is given to the feltness of what unfolds, the not yet known, and resisting the urge to jump to immediate, well-worn explanations of what it is we think is going on. So this quote from Stuart is really helpful, I think, when we're thinking affectively and what affect is and how it works in our research. She says the ordinary throws itself together out of forms, flows, powers, pleasures, encounters, distractions, drudge, denials, practical solutions, shape-shifting forms of violence, daydreams, and opportunities lost. So this resonates across the approaches that are taken by these various researchers that I've introduced to you and that feature in the chapter. And philosophically informed research that actively puts theories to work requires this kind of affective engagement, deep immersion, and giving over to the feltness of what bubbles up. It then requires ongoing attunement to the more than, which hails attention, or to borrow from Maggie McClure, glows, which then requires further excavation to understand wider historical, political, and social force relations. So in common, the authors included in our chapter have consciously resisted going in search of ready-made explanations. Rather, through their situated evocations, they have explored the ebb and flow of power relations that make up the forces of gendered becomings in early childhood. So you can kind of see how gender in early childhood is not exclusively about the bounded human subject as a biological gendered being. Gender is endlessly produced differently through these micro encounters. And we need to be open to kind of tuning into what are the force relations that produce gender in that moment, which then can be produced differently in the next moment and the next moment. So it's constantly on the move. Okay, coming to an end. So also what matters in childhood research, having said all of that about the bounded human subjects, humans do matter. They are not removed from our inquiries. And this is often a criticism that's frequently waged against post-humanist childhood scholarship, is that the child is, there's a risk that the child will be erased from research interest, analysis, and articulation. So this small sample of childhood studies that I've shared with you, framed by feminist posthumanism, goes some way to illustrate that humans continue to matter in very significant ways. And attending to how gendering processes are produced through human, non, and more than human relationalities illuminates the urgency to firstly challenge human exceptionalism, i.e. that we're the most important and we sit atop the hierarchy. And secondly, to appreciate our infected and affected connection to the world in its iterative becomings. As Ferrando contests, posthumanists are anti-humanists, not anti-human. So whilst the onto-ethico-epistemological approaches presented in our chapter are committed to dissolving the category human, the fleshy, porous, relationally entangled becoming human remains very much in play. Berard's deconstruction requires that human is understood as interconnected through endlessly forming networks of socio-political, material discursive, nature, culture, human, non-human relations, such as those that I've shared from these various studies. So decentering the human does not involve flattening difference or flattening the heterogeneity of what constitutes human, but rather requires reconfiguring what the always in process human child is historically and symbolically, and why and how that matters to debates and practices regarding gender in early childhood. Okay, I have no idea how long. So you can access, if you're interested, you can access a pre-publication copy of this chapter in its fullness from here. And have I got anything else, or is that it? That's it. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because that's a lot to digest. But maybe people have immediate questions or challenges or comments that they'd like to share, and I'm very happy to take them.
Thanks, Jane. That was just wonderful, very provocative for a Monday kickoff into our week. And there were so many concepts there that kind of provoked. So I'm sure there's going to be quite a few reflections for anybody in our audience that would like to, not audience, part of our group, sorry, who would like to jump in and talk to Jane about anything or reflect on anything at all. If not, I've got bits and bobs, but Victoria, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. That was quite the roller coaster. Um, there is indeed an enormous amount to unpack. I've just become obsessed in my brain. I've still got this notion of crush assemblages. Because I grew up with boys, I was considered a real tomboy at school and a bit too, aggressive, I guess. Certainly too active for a lot of the teachers. There's a lot of holding back. And when I was a primary school teacher myself, I deliberately let them go to let girls, probably encourage girls, to be honest, to go to the top of the wool bars and learn some football skills. And, sort of in a sense, I suppose I had a kind of rage about how those crush assemblages had been viewed, as a child, actually, that they've been viewed as fighting, exclusively as fighting. And I thought that chimed really well with a great deal of what you said about, all of it, time, space, affect, and how gender is produced in those moments often by the onlooker, by the adult onlooker who, and I think somewhere else you said you saw education. I mean, I've definitely seen some education as a series of missed opportunities. And that is one, really, isn't it? The idea of the fight between children and with children, viewing that, discussing it, the whole decades of poor response to bullying seems to me to somehow chime really closely to how, our understanding of gender has been very limited. I guess that's a statement rather than a question.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the key here is for us adults, the knowers, to kind of suspend that sense of knowing, and that we are somehow expert, and that our reading of a situation is the correct reading and the only reading. Because what that does with the girl who's at the bottom of the crush with the three boys repeatedly piling up on her is it sets her up as victim, and it reinforces the idea of gendered childhood as the subservient girl or the victimized girl and the aggressive boys. But actually there was so much else going on. But it took a huge, because Tuya and EJ are staunch feminist activists. Gendered violence is a big thing they're very concerned about, which was their motivation for doing the research in the first place. But actually there was a kind of, okay, hang on a second, what else is unfolding here? And then when they started to think of take place seriously, so the history of that Finnish coastal town with its demise in fishing and working class communities, and and the space and the I haven't gone into detail here, but the significance of this particular restaurant and communities, and how then when they started to sit with, okay, so how does class intersect with gender, intersect with age, intersect with space, place, histories, then you have this kind of really complex picture emerging of working class communities and the recently introduced ICT community. And so this was as much about social class, actually, and mobility, as it was about gender. And it was also about the specificity of that place. And so if you jump to that immediate conclusion that it's that girl being the victim of gendered violence, sexual violence, then it doesn't leave you anywhere to go. So that's where I think, often feminist post-humanist approaches are described as hopeful. And I don't think in the conventional sense, oh, we must all be hopeful, things will be better, but hopeful in the sense that we create space to think more broadly and deeply. And that for me is why I think that this holds great potential, to kind of to generate new knowledge and to think with the children that we research with, not make sense of that which we think we understand, because we go with these normative tropes of that's what's going on, therefore that is what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's sort of approaching much more with a kind of play mentality in a way, isn't it? So that I'm ready to imagine any possibility.
But also not tolerate, it's like, Tia and EJ are very much, well, and there's a beautiful section in the paper where they grapple with this: should we intervene and say that's not okay? And so what is their role as the adult, and what is it that they're seeing? So there's a very brutal honesty about how difficult this stuff is, and it isn't just anything goes, but it is also creating space for that girl to negotiate what's going on in a different way.
Sure. Yeah.
Just to jump in on there, it's from a rights-based lens. It's really provoking me to reflect on the kind of focus we've got that's quite dominant at the moment about school readiness and the curriculum content and focus. And when all of these aspects of from government down trickle into our settings, into our practice, they actually impact on how we do see what we see, hear what we hear, and understand or begin to become more conscious. Because if our brains are focused on all this bureaucratic, I must get this done, I must get this done for this school readiness aspect, all the points that you've talked about, Jane, about our, how the entanglement of what the daily interactions are and how we unpick that and how we become immersed in it and become to be more conscious of it. Well, you need time and space to do that. However, the matter that we've inherited through the political lens and through educational systems actually prevents and kind of becomes quite dominant. So therefore the space and the place becomes toxic in a way against all of the points that we're talking about here through a child's rights lens, which is where I'm coming from, about, there's this binary opposition, or there's these ways that we have to get children to certain points, and when we do that, that impacts on how we listen to them. It impacts on how we listen to ourselves and how we create a new understanding through that diffractiveness that you were talking about earlier. So there's so much. Yes, all of these engagements are really vital and important, and that's the human contact of it, but the non-human through the curricula is a beast. Dare I say.
Yeah, I think the point you're making is really important, because I suppose from a post-humanist perspective, a feminist post-humanist, you could flip it and say, not is the human child ready for school, but is the school ready for children? And then you start to think about, the organization of space, the atmospheres that are generated, the materials that are in the place, the expectations. The atmosphere is informed by the curriculum, by the expectations, by the rhythm of the day, and that children will sit still in their boxes on their dots, all of that stuff. That works on children's bodies to produce certain sorts of children who are then deemed not school ready. But actually we need to think about, we could think about it from another. So if you made matter your starting place rather than the rights of the child, I'm not saying the rights of the child aren't important, but it kind of flips your starting place, and therefore flips the places you can go and the narratives that you can tell. You probably arrive at a similar sort of place, because we're all childhood scholars and concerned with children, and that they should thrive in life. But it's about their relationships to space, place, matter, atmospheres, and how they're produced within those contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we don't hear the children, we're not going to realise where they are or how we're going to engage with them and to immerse in. So yeah, absolutely. There was a point from Faith who she said the pre-publication chapter, she missed where she could get that from. Could you repeat or add it onto the chat?
Yeah, I'll copy it in here now.
Thank you. And we're coming towards an end. Is there anybody that wanted to have a look? We've got 4 minutes before our lunchtime session ends. Does anybody else want to come in on here just to share reflections, make a comment? Okay, just Just to let you know, the SIRS link will to this recording will be on the SIRS on the chat. There's a link to our SIRS website, Childhood and Society, and we'll put the recording of this session on in case you want to come back again and have a look or share it with somebody. And there's also a list of all the SIRS 2025 series for you to have a look at, and to please pass on, and please continue to join us so we can develop a network of discussion and opportunities, and do contact Jane to discuss further, I think.
Okay, I've just put that link in the chat, so if people want to just grab that before we go.
Thank you, Jane. Any last reflections at all about where you're going to move forward with
well, I think, you know, once you start researching in this mode, you can't, it's hard to imagine any other way. But I think what's quite exciting is this, you know, when you look at how long this has been going on, it's not new. And actually it owes a debt of gratitude to Indigenous and decolonial feminist scholarship, so that, you know, it's not people shouldn't be afraid of it, you know. And I think that that's what this chapter was about, saying actually when you approach the study of gender from this philosophical vantage point, how does it differ, what does it do, what does it make possible? So yeah, I think I'll just carry on as I am.
Fantastic. Okay, well, listen, on behalf of Middlesex University, SIRS, the Child and Society SIG, thank you, Jane, for presenting your research and your expertise with us. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And we really look forward, and hopefully you'll be able to come to us in January, where myself and Diane Boyd and Kerry Lee are going to be sharing with you our insights and experiences and research with sustainable pedagogy within the discipline of early childhood. What makes early childhood sustainable or not, and what are we doing in there to make it sustainable, and what are children doing? So we'll be presenting that on the 20th of January. So we do hope to see you all again and share some more space together. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Jane, thank you so much.
You're welcome.